Calvin Reese was 37 years old the afternoon he pulled into his own driveway and found a key that no longer worked. He tried it twice. The way you do when you assume the problem is you, your angle, your grip, the humidity warping the barrel. But the key did not turn. It stopped precisely, firmly, and finally, the way something stops when it has been specifically designed to stop. He stood on the porch of the house he had owned since before he met the woman now inside it, and he understood, in the particular way that a man who has spent his entire career moving goods across a continent understands things, that someone had made a decision and executed it on a timeline he had not been shown. That was fine. He understood timelines. What Nicole Reese did not know, what she had never once tried to find out in 5 years of marriage, was that the house she had just locked him out of represented the smallest of his real estate holdings by both square footage and assessed value. She did not know about the other 4 properties in Shelby County, registered to an LLC she had never heard of. She did not know that the quiet man she had dismissed as a regional dispatch coordinator for a freight company was, in fact, principal owner of the freight company. She did not know that his net worth, as of the prior fiscal year, was slightly over $4, $1 million and growing. She had changed the locks on a door she did not own. He did not knock. He did not call. He walked back to his truck, set his keys on the seat, and made one phone call to a woman named Felicia Drake, who practiced real estate and family law out of a 3-room office in East Memphis, and who had handled Calvin's property matters since 2017. What happened next would cost Nicole Reese the house, the contents, the narrative, every version of the future she had spent 9 months designing. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. 6 weeks before the locks changed, Calvin was up before the city. Memphis in late September had a particular quality in the early morning. The heat of summer still in the concrete, but the air beginning to lose its certainty about it, a hesitation before the turn. Calvin sat in the side yard of the house on Goodwin Avenue, in a lawn chair he had owned for 11 years, the same chair his grandmother had kept on her back porch in Whitehaven, drank his coffee and watched the light find the persimmon tree he had planted in the first year he owned the house. The tree was his, put it in the ground himself. It had been a bare whip of a sapling then. Now it was the kind of tree you looked at and understood something had been tended there. He was a logistics man by disposition as much as by profession. He thought in systems. He thought in dependencies and bottlenecks and the sequence of things. His grandmother, Ida Reese, had seen this in him early. She had told him once, standing at kitchen window watching him reorganize the spice cabinet at age 9 without being asked, in a voice that mixed pride with caution. Calvin, the problem with knowing how everything fits together is that you'll always see when something doesn't. She had been right. She had been right about most things. She had passed 3 years ago in November. He had driven to Whitehaven and sat in the house for 2 days by himself before he could find the shape of life without her in it. Cole came through the back door at 7:15 in her robe, phone already in hand, kissed him on the top of his head the way you kiss someone when you are already somewhere else. She asked if he wanted breakfast. He told her he was fine. She made herself coffee and went back inside without sitting down, and Calvin noted, with the part of himself that logged such things, that she had not sat with him on a weekend morning in 6 weeks. He noted it the way a dispatcher notes a gap in routing without alarm, with attention. His work phone, the company-issued one, not the personal device that sat in a locked drawer in his home office and bore the contact information for his attorney, his accountant, 3 property managers, and the CFO of Reese Consolidated Freight, buzzed with an overnight exception report from the Nashville hub. He dealt with it in 4 minutes. He was efficient that way. They had met in 2017 at a mutual friend's cookout in Midtown. She had been a pharmaceutical sales rep then, sharp and put together and funnier than her professional bearing suggested. She had noticed the calluses on his hands and asked about them directly, which he had found refreshing. He told her he worked with his hands when he wasn't at the office. She had not pressed further. He had not offered more. That arrangement had seemed, at the time, like comfortable compatibility. He understood now that it had been something else entirely, that she had filed the question away and chosen not to pursue the answer because the answer had seemed unlikely to improve her situation. She had built a picture of him from the visible surfaces and called it knowledge. Calvin did not hold it against her. He had understood the picture she was building. He had simply never corrected it. The persimmon tree caught the morning light. He finished his coffee. He went inside. That afternoon, coming out of the Kroger on Poplar, he saw Nicole's car in the parking lot of a wine bar 3 doors down. A silver Audi he did not recognize was parked beside it at an angle that suggested arrival rather than coincidence. He drove past without slowing. He noted the plates. He did not mention it when he got home. He ran the plates himself that evening through a contact at the county clerk's office, a favor owed from a freight licensing matter 2 years prior. The Audi belonged to a man named Damon Phelps. Damon Phelps had a LinkedIn profile and a downtown Memphis address and a title that said Senior Portfolio Manager at a wealth management firm. He had an ex-wife in Germantown and a civil judgment from 2021 for $14,800 in a disputed personal loan. He was 41. He photographed well. Calvin looked at this information for a long moment. Then he closed the tab. He did not feel the thing people expected men to feel in that moment. He felt instead the specific sensation he recognized from his freight work. The sensation of looking at a manifest and seeing a number that did match the weight on the dock. The system had been off balance. Now he knew in which direction. He drove to the office the next morning, the real office on the 3rd floor of the Reese Consolidated building in Fraser that Nicole had visited exactly once for the Christmas party in 2019 and had described afterward as smaller than she expected. He sat down with his operations manager, Earl Watts, told Earl he needed the next 10 days to handle a personal matter and that Earl should run the floor as though Calvin was not available. Earl had known Calvin for 14 years. He nodded once and asked no other questions. Calvin sat alone at the desk that his grandfather had used in this same building when it was a different kind of business, and he began the way. He always began any logistics problem, at the beginning, with the data. He pulled every joint account statement for the past 18 months. The withdrawals were not dramatic in isolation. They were the kind of numbers that looked like ordinary household drift until you mapped them against purpose. $100 in February, $900 in March. A transfer of $3,800 in April to an account in Nicole's name only, which he had known about and assumed was her personal savings. Another transfer to the same account in June, $4,400. July, $2,900. In August alone, 3 transfers totaling $9,200. The total across 18 months was $44,600. He was very still. His face remained perfectly calm. He cross-referenced the transfer dates against his own travel log. The weeks he had been in Nashville, Little Rock, Jackson, Kansas City. Every transfer over $2,000 had been initiated while he was away from Memphis. That was not accident. That was operational planning. He opened the county assessor's records next. The house on Goodwin Avenue was titled in both names, as it had been since 2018 when she moved in, and they had retitled it jointly, at her request, which he had agreed to as a gesture of partnership. He had agreed without concern because he understood, as she apparently did not, that joint title in Tennessee worked in both directions. You could not remove a co-owner from a deed by changing the hardware on the door. His name was on that deed. It would remain on that deed until a court said otherwise, and no court was going to say otherwise given what he was now assembling. He reached into the locked drawer, removed the personal phone, and called Felicia Drake. She answered on the second ring. He told her to pull the Goodwin deed and run a full marital asset review. He told her he would be in her office by Thursday. He named the file on his laptop simply NAR. Then he set the phone down and turned back to his manifest. He was a logistics man. He knew how to move things from where they were to where they needed to be. Felicia Drake had a way of reading documents that made other lawyers seem like they were reading for the first time. She was 53, practiced in Memphis for 28 years, and kept a small framed needlepoint behind her desk that said, in plain block letters, "Possession is 9/10. The deed is 10/10." Calvin had always appreciated that about her. She reviewed the joint account statements, the transfer log, the property assessment, and the 3 pages of notes Calvin had prepared laying out the timeline in the clean, sequential format he used for freight exception reports. She did not speak until she had read everything twice. Then she said, "She changed the locks." Calvin said, "Saturday afternoon I was at the warehouse." Felicia set down the pages, she said. "In Tennessee, changing the locks on a jointly titled property without a court order for exclusive possession is unlawful exclusion. She does not have the legal standing to lock you out of your own home." She paused. "You can re-enter today. I can have a locksmith there inside 2 hours. You are within your rights and she has no legal recourse." He told her he knew that. He told her he had not gone back because he was not ready to go back yet. Felicia looked at him with the expression of someone who has represented a man like Calvin exactly once before, and knows what it means when they say, "Yet," she said. "What do you need from me first?" He told her. The full marital asset inventory, the fraudulent transfer filing for the $44,600, an emergency motion to prevent any further withdrawals from the joint account, in that order. He also told her about Damon Phelps, the civil judgment for the $14,800 personal loan, and asked her to have a process server confirm his downtown address. She wrote everything down without expression. Then she said, in the flat and clarifying tone she used when she wanted a client to understand their position without sentiment, "Calvin, she locked you out of a house worth $310,000. The marital estate, including your disclosed assets as co-owner of Reese Consolidated, is worth considerably more than that." She let that sit a moment. She didn't know what she was touching. Some things were not problems. They were just answers waiting on the right question. He drove afterward to see his uncle Roosevelt, who had worked 30 years as a Shelby County Sheriff's deputy, and now lived in a yellow house in Whitehaven 4 blocks from where Calvin had grown up. Roosevelt was in the garage when Calvin arrived, resurfacing a workbench with the focused patience of a man who had learned patience the hard way. He listened to the whole story without putting down the sandpaper. When Calvin finished, Roosevelt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Damon Phelps, I know that name." He set down the sandpaper. He was connected to a property scheme over in Binghamton a few years back. Somebody, I want to say a woman, put money into a renovation deal he was running, and the property flipped under a different LLC before she could see a return. She filed a complaint. It went nowhere because the paperwork was technically clean, but the investigator I talked to said the structure was designed to drain the co-investor. He looked at Calvin steadily. "He's done this before." Calvin asked if Roosevelt could get him the investigator's name. Roosevelt said he could have it by morning. By the following Tuesday, Calvin's investigator had pulled Phelps's full entity history, 6 LLCs across 3 counties, 4 of which had been formed with a female co-member, 3 of which had been dissolved within 2 years, showing minimal returns to the co-member and substantial management fees to Phelps. One of the dissolved entities had received a wire transfer of $9,200 in August. The same month, Nicole had transferred $9,200 from the joint account. The money had left the marital estate and gone directly into a vehicle Phelps controlled. Calvin forwarded everything to Felicia and then drove back to Goodwin Avenue. He parked in front of the house. He looked at the persimmon tree in the side yard, visible over the roofline, the branches beginning to hold their first small fruit. Planted that tree. It had taken 7 years to produce. He started the truck and drove away. He had one more thing to prepare before he was ready to go home. He called Earl Watts from the road and told him to have the Q3 freight volume report ready for Friday. Business did not stop because your personal life needed attention. That was logistics. You routed around the obstacle. You delivered anyway. There was nothing dramatic about the way Calvin went back to the house on Goodwin Avenue. He arrived on a Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. With a licensed locksmith, Felicia Drake's letter of legal authority in his jacket pocket, and the original deed, pulled from the county recorder, certified, bearing his name in the clean black type of a document that had never been amended in a manila envelope. The locksmith looked at the letter. He looked at the deed. He said, "You're on the title." Calvin said, "I am." The locksmith worked for 11 minutes. Calvin stood on the porch and watched the street and thought about routing. In freight, when a load was misdirected, you did not argue with the address it had been sent to. You pulled the original manifest, showed the correct destination, and you moved the load. That was all this was, a correction, a return to the documented original. The new key turned cleanly. He walked through his own front door and stood in the entryway and looked at the house. It was as he had left it, more or less, except that 3 of his framed photographs had been moved to the hallway closet. Family pictures, his grandmother at a birthday table, the Whitehaven house in summer, himself at 19, with a freight yard in the background. Someone had decided to move the evidence of his life out of the common rooms. He noted this without comment. He took the photographs out of the closet and set them on the kitchen counter face-up. Then he set his bag on the table and called Nicole. She answered after 4 rings, her voice careful and controlled in the way it became when she was already constructing. He told her where he was. He told her to come home. He said it the way he said everything, level, without sharpness, without theater. She arrived 45 minutes later to find Calvin at the kitchen table, the deed on the surface between 2 coffee mugs, his cousin Renarda seated beside him. Renarda, who was a paralegal at Felicia's office and had known Calvin since childhood and who had the kind of unreadable composure that made people say everything they had planned to withhold. Felicia herself was on speakerphone, her voice filling the kitchen with the flat precision of statute and consequence. Cole stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and looked at the deed. Felicia spoke without preamble. She walked through the unlawful exclusion, the Tennessee statute, the penalty, the exposure Nicole had created the moment she had the locksmith come. She walked through the bank transfers, each one dated, each one cross-referenced against Calvin's travel log the total of $44,600, the fraudulent transfer claim, the connection to Damon Phelps's LLC, and the wire transfer in August that had moved marital assets into a vehicle. Phelps controlled. Then Renarda placed a second document on the table, a summary of Reese Consolidated Freight's last fiscal year, the 4 Shelby County properties held by the LLC, the total disclosed net worth as of December 31st. She placed it face up without commentary and folded her hands. The room was quiet for a long time. Renarda had grown up on the same block as Calvin. She had watched Ida Reese raise him. She had watched him build the freight business from a single leased truck and a route between Memphis and Nashville. She had never once, in all those years, heard him raise his voice. She sat with the same stillness now. Cole was looking at the net worth figure. She had gone very still. Nicole said, "Calvin." I didn't. She stopped. She was looking at the LLC summary, the way you look at something that restructures your understanding of the previous 5 years, in a single read. She said, "I didn't know any of this existed," Calvin said. "I know you didn't." She looked up. That had not been the response she expected, he said. "That's the part that mattered to me. Not what you were taking, what you didn't think was worth asking about." He folded his hands on the table. "You looked at me for 5 years and decided what you saw was everything there was. You built a plan on that assumption." He was quiet for a moment. "Was a bad assumption, Nicole." She looked at the deed. She looked at Renarda. She looked at the phone where Felicia's voice had been. She said, "What happens now?" Felicia said, "What happens now is the filing I submitted this morning, the recovery of the transferred funds, the exclusive possession motion that you will not be contesting. Because contesting it would require you to explain the August wire to a judge." She paused. "What happens to you now depends entirely on what you do in the next 10 days. Nicole did not cry. That surprised Calvin faintly. She sat down, finally, in the chair across from him, and she looked like someone who had just understood the load-bearing math of the situation. How much weight she had placed on a floor she had never once inspected. Calvin stood. He picked up the deed and returned it to the envelope. He looked at her once, without anger, without performance. He said, "The persimmon tree is mine. I'll be taking it when I go." He walked out of the kitchen and down the hall and into his home office, where he sat at his desk and opened the Q3 freight report. The work resumed as it always had, patient and uninterrupted. 10 months passed the way a well-run route passes, efficiently, without drama, each leg completing on schedule. Calvin had moved into a restored bungalow in Cooper Young that he had owned quietly for 3 years as an investment property and never once mentioned to Nicole. He had spent 2 weekends painting the interior himself, a warm slate on the walls of the main room, white trim throughout, and he had transplanted the persimmon tree from Goodwin Avenue into the backyard where the light was right, taken without complaint. He had expected it would. He was sitting on the back steps on a Sunday morning with his coffee when Adrian came through the screen door and sat beside him on the step, her own mug in both hands. She was a civil rights attorney, sharp and specific, who had grown up 3 blocks from where Calvin grew up, and had somehow never crossed his path until Roosevelt introduced them at a cookout previous spring. She asked questions that went somewhere. She did not perform for rooms. She had looked at the persimmon tree on her first visit, what kind it was, and when he told her had said simply, "That's a patient tree." He had thought about that for several days. They sat in the early quiet and watched the tree. Reese Consolidated had finished the year at $6.3 million in gross freight volume, a 19% increase over the prior year. A second Nashville hub was under contract. Calvin had begun a mentorship program for young logistics workers, coming out of the Southwest Tennessee Workforce Development Pipeline, which his grandmother would have found correct. Goodwin Avenue had gone to Nicole in the settlement, offset against the recovery of the $44,600 in transferred funds and a cash equalization for Calvin's share of the appreciated marital value. The Shelby County LLC properties had been ruled entirely premarital and remained untouched. Damon Phelps had been named in a civil complaint by 2 former business partners, who, had it appeared, finally found a reason to coordinate. He was last known to be operating out of a smaller market and doing considerably quieter business. A mutual friend had mentioned, without being asked, Nicole was in pharmaceutical sales again, working a territory in the eastern suburbs. The social network they had shared had organized itself around the story the way social networks do. Nicole's side of it had grown quieter in proportion to how clearly the story was understood. Her mother had sent Calvin a fruit basket in February. He had sent a handwritten note back. He bore no one any lasting harm. He pressed a cutting into the soil at the base of the persimmon tree, a fig start that Roosevelt had given him from his own yard, wrapped in a damp cloth and newspaper the way their grandmothers had always moved plants between houses. He pressed it in carefully, firmed the soil, watered it slowly. What you planted in the right ground, he thought, had a way of staying. He was solvent, he was settled. He was at peace with the particular satisfaction of a man who had known exactly what he owned and had never needed to explain it to anyone until the moment it needed to be explained completely. The morning light came down through the persimmon tree and laid itself across the yard in the unhurried way of things that have nowhere else to be. Adrian said something quietly, and he answered, and the screen door was open, and the coffee was still, warm. He was home. "I hope you enjoyed that one." Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.